On a freezing night in Westbridge, a story of kindness and fate. The wind cut sharp against Marcus' skin as he pulled his thin hoodie tighter around himself, his fingers stiff from the cold. He walked with his head down, his sneakers so worn that each step on the cracked sidewalk sent a small jolt of pain through his feet. The streets of Westbridge were lined with tired buildings, their paint peeling like old scars, windows dimly lit by the weak glow of street lamps. It was a part of town people didn't talk about, the kind of place where the buses ran late, the grocery stores overcharged for spoiled food, and the landlords didn't bother fixing what was broken because they knew nobody could afford to leave. Marcus, just 12 years old, but carrying the weight of someone twice his age, clutched the small burlap bag slung over his shoulder. It was empty except for a few crumpled soda cans he had collected from the sidewalk. Barely worth $1 at the recycling center, but maybe enough to buy a piece of bread from the corner store. He had learned to stretch a meal, to ignore the gnawing hunger that had become more of a dull ache than something to be feared. As he passed the corner of Maple and 18th Street, the usual group of kids from Parkview Middle stood under the awning of a well-lit coffee shop, their voices cutting through the night like blades. Marcus didn't have to look up to know they were watching him. He could feel the weight of their stares, the sneers curling their lips. "Hey, look, it's the little trash collector," one of them jeered. It was Blake, a tall boy with neatly styled blonde hair and an expensive-looking coat. "Find anything good today? Maybe a new pair of shoes?" Laughter erupted from the group. Marcus clenched his jaw, but kept walking. He knew better than to respond. People like them, kids who had never gone to bed hungry, never had to scrape together change for food, would never understand. Another voice, softer but dripping with the same cruelty, chimed in. "Maybe if you smile, someone will throw you a few pennies. Or maybe not." Blake snickered. Nobody tipped street rats. Marcus' stomach twisted, but he didn't slow down. He had learned long ago that fighting back only made things worse. His mother had warned him about boys like them. "You don't get to make mistakes the way they do," she had told him once, her voice low and firm. A black boy standing up for himself is always seen as trouble, no matter how right he is. He turned the corner, leaving the sound of their laughter behind him. His pace quickened, his hands tightening into fists inside his hoodie. He wished, just for once, that he could make them understand, that he could show them what it felt like to go home to an apartment where the heat had been shut off for weeks, to watch his mother work herself to exhaustion for pennies, to have a 6-year-old sister ask if they would have food tomorrow and not know the answer. He hadn't meant to stop here, but his feet carried him anyway, drawn to the quiet solitude beneath the dim streetlights. The city moved beyond the iron gates, cars honking, voices calling, but inside the park, everything was still. The swing set creaked in the wind, the trees rustled softly, and for a moment, Marcus just stood there, breathing, letting the silence press against his skin. Then he saw him. The old man sat hunched on a weathered bench, his thin jacket barely covering his frail body. His white hair was tousled, the wind tugging at it like restless fingers. His hands, spotted with age, trembled in his lap. His face, pale and lined with deep creases, was set in an expression of quiet confusion. He wasn't moving, wasn't looking at anything in particular, just staring at the ground like he was trying to remember something that had slipped through his grasp. Marcus hesitated, his body instinctively telling him to keep walking. This wasn't his problem. He had enough to worry about. An empty stomach, overdue bills, a mother who worked herself to exhaustion, a sister who needed more than he could give. But something about the way the man sat there, so small, so lost, made Marcus pause. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Sir," his voice felt too loud in the stillness. The old man didn't react. Marcus tried again, softer this time. "Hey, are you okay?" Slowly, the man lifted his head. His pale, washed-out blue eyes met Marcus with a flicker of recognition, then clouded over again like a fog rolling in. His lips parted, his breath uneven. I don't know," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus frowned, glancing around the park. The place was nearly empty. No one else seemed to notice the old man sitting there, shivering, lost in whatever place his mind had taken him. Marcus could see it now. The way the man's clothes, though old, were once expensive. The way his shoes were polished but scuffed from wandering. He didn't belong here. Do you? Marcus hesitated. Do you know where you're supposed to be? The man blinked slowly, his gaze unfocused. I was with someone, I think. But I can't. I can't remember. His voice cracked on a last word, his fingers twitching against his lap as if trying to grasp something invisible. His entire body trembled, not just from the cold, but from something deeper, something Marcus couldn't name. Marcus clenched his jaw, his mind racing. He had no idea what to do. He should call someone, except he didn't have a phone. He could go find a cop. But what if they didn't care? What if they treated this man the way they treated so many people in this neighborhood, as an inconvenience rather than someone in need? His stomach growled, reminding him of the single slice of bread waiting for him at home. He was starving. His mother and Layla were waiting. He didn't have time for this. But then he looked at the man again, the way his hands curled into his thin jacket, as if that alone could keep the cold out, the way his lips were beginning to turn pale. Marcus exhaled, his breath visible in the cold air. He had been cold before. He knew what it felt like when it sank into your bones, when you shivered so hard your muscles ached. And he knew hunger too. He knew what it was like to feel empty, to be invisible, to be ignored. His mother's voice echoed in his mind. Be better than the world is to you. Marcus sighed, pulling off his hoodie and stepping closer. Here, he muttered, draping it over the man's shoulders. The old man looked at him, startled, and something in his face shifted, not quite understanding, but something close to gratitude. Marcus swallowed hard. Come on, he said before he could change his mind. It's too cold to be out here. You can. He hesitated, his heart pounding. You can come home with me for the night. The man stared at him, blinking slowly. Home? Marcus nodded, ignoring the voice in his head screaming that this was a bad idea. Just for the night, he clarified. You need a place to stay, and... He hesitated again, then sighed. I can't just leave you here. For a long moment, the old man didn't move. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers gripping Marcus' sleeve like a child afraid of getting lost. Marcus' chest tightened. He shifted the weight of his empty bag over his shoulder, took a steadying breath, and started walking.